You're listening to the Sex and Psychology Podcast, the sex ed you never got in school and won't get anywhere else. I am your host, Dr. Justin Lehmiller. I am a social psychologist and research fellow at the Kinsey Institute and author of the book, Tell Me What You Want, The Science of Sexual Desire and How It Can Help You Improve Your Sex Life. When people hear the word kink, they often imagine something that's really extreme. But in reality, kink comprises a wide spectrum of activities. Kink is actually a much broader and far more common part of human sexuality than most people realize. In this episode, we're diving into what kink is and what it isn't. We'll answer questions such as where do kinks come from and why are so many people turned on by power exchange? In addition, we'll bust a lot of common myths and misconceptions about kink, such as the idea that kink is always rooted in some type of trauma. If you've ever wondered why people want what they want, or you just want to learn more about the world of kink, this episode is for you. My guest is Gigi Engel, a certified sex and relationship psychotherapist and sex educator. Gigi is an associate clinician at the Therapy Yard, where she specializes in work with gender, sexuality, and relationship-diverse clients. She is also the author of 2 books, with her latest being titled Kink Curious. This is going to be a fascinating conversation that will bust a lot of myths and set the record straight about kink. Stick around, and we're going to jump in right after the break. Are you curious about sex and psychology in other countries? Join me and Sexual Health Alliance as we expand your knowledge through their study abroad programs. We'll explore different cultures, engage in immersive learning experiences, and collaborate with international experts while traveling to amazing places and having fun with students from all around the world. Since 2015, Sexual Health Alliance has remained at the forefront of sexuality education. Join me and Shaw and a global community of students for a transformative study abroad adventure. Our 2026 study abroad offerings include courses in Paris and Amsterdam. Check them out and learn more at sexualhealthalliance.com. Come meet fantastic people and be at the leading edge of sexual health education with Sexual Health Alliance. Spots for 2026 are available now. Visit sexualhealthalliance.com to secure yours today and embark on an exciting global adventure to study sex and psychology with me. Hi, Gigi, and welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Well, it's great to have you here. You've just published a new book titled Kink Curious. So I'm curious, what's the brief story behind this book? Why did you write it? And who is this book for?
Sure. I mean, the book is for really anybody who's interested in exploring sexuality that's outside the box. So curious beginners to well-seasoned kinksters, I think, can get something out of it because it really looks at kink from a really trauma-informed lens and has a lot of hands-on exercises, journal prompts, that kind of thing. But when it came to writing it, I had publishers. My publisher actually came to me and was like, do you want to write a kink guide? And I have been writing for all these publications for a really long time, and I've pretty much written about every kink that has come across my purview, like alien dildos to giantess kinks to all these sorts of things. So I was like, a kink guide, what? That is not going to be something that is going to be interesting to me. But then I was like thinking about it more and I was kind of putting it together and mapping it out. And I realized that there really wasn't a lot on the market that had this kind of trauma-informed lens, that had a lot of really hands-on kind of workbook style things inside of it. So you could actually start from the very beginning of your kink journey, from like learning what kink is to how the psychology behind it to some more niche play to like figuring out what it is you're actually into and learning about the physical safety and the mental safety. And I think it just sort of came together as being a much more exciting and in-depth project than I had originally anticipated. So I'm really happy with the way it turned out. But it's a culmination now of a lot of my years working as a sex writer and also as a psychosexual therapist who specializes in kink. And my first book that I wrote was more an agony aunt style, which was much more in line with where I was in my career at the time, which was kind of an agony aunt advice writer, kind of giving sex advice based on my own experience, which we know is not particularly universal. So this is much more reflective of where I am in my career at this stage.
Yeah, and I think it's a great comprehensive guide to all things kink. You know, it's not just, here's a rundown of different kinky things people are into. It's a really comprehensive look at, well, what is the world of kink? Why are people into it? What do we need to know about it? What do people get wrong about it? And what do you need to know if you're thinking about potentially exploring it in your own life? So I think you're right that no matter where you fall on the kink spectrum, there's something that you can learn from this. So, for a lot of people, when they hear the word kink, they tend to imagine something that's really extreme or maybe something that's on the fringes. But kink can mean a lot of different things. So, how do you define kink? What does that term mean to you?
To me, it's a really big umbrella term that basically looks at any kind of sexual interest or acts that are outside of the sort of heteronormative patriarchal script. So basically anything that isn't like penetration, hand sex, oral sex. And for some people, they might consider sex toys to be kinky. I don't personally, but I kind of like anything that's kind of outside of the more here's how to spice up your sex life with a sex toy kind of sex. And I think when people think about kink, they immediately go to 50 Shades of Grey, Red Room of Pain, flogging, spanking, all of that kind of stuff. But kink is actually so much more about a full sensory experience that can include everything from sensation play to role play to all kinds of more intense play. And sure, pain play and flogging and all of that is definitely a part of it, but it's really only a small piece of a much larger puzzle.
Yeah, I think kink is a term that a lot of people have misconceptions about. And for example, a lot of people assume that kink necessarily means fetish, but fetish is actually a specific subtype of kink where someone is really aroused by a particular object. And what their arousal to that object is about could be multisensory. It could be about the way something looks or smells or tastes or feels. And so, yeah, kink is this big term that means a lot of different things. And a kink could be a fetish, right? So all fetishes by definition are kinks, but not every kink is necessarily a fetish. But I think one of the biggest challenges when we're talking about kink is that to the average person, it's so subjective. I mean, after all, what feels kinky or edgy to one person might feel completely mainstream or vanilla to someone else. So when people hear this term, or when somebody says that they're kinky, they might be talking about drastically different things. So in light of this, I was wondering, can we really say whether anything is objectively kinky when people have these really different ideas about it in the first place?
I think that's a really good point. I always say, like, to know kink is to love kink, and whatever is kinky to you is kind of in the eye of the beholder. So someone can honestly find French kissing to be kinky, and that is their prerogative. I think it's one of the beautiful things about really understanding the sort of foundational levels of kink is really understanding that it is entirely subjective and it is about the person who's experiencing it. So it's if you say you're kinky just because something you're doing might be a regular Tuesday night to somebody else doesn't necessarily mean you're not kinky because you're the only person who gets to define that.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. If you think about even something like anal sex, right? For many people, that's just part of their regular sexual practice, and that's not considered at all kinky to them. But for other people, that might be considered a really kinky thing to try. So it's all very subjective. And, I don't think we want to be the kink police and go around determining whether or not people are kinky. It's just one of those things where different people have different ideas about this, and that makes it a little bit messy, but that's okay. We're in the business of sex. We like things messy.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's like we can roll our eyes at people if they say something that's really like normalized and you're like, that's not kinky. You're allowed to have your own opinions about it, but that doesn't mean they're not kinky, and we should withhold our judgment.
I agree. So a lot of people want to know where their kinks came from, and that's something that you talk a lot about in the book. So what did you learn in the process of researching this question? From a psychological standpoint, do kinks typically have identifiable origins? Like, do we know where they come from?
It kind of comes from two different places. There's definitely a lot of people where they can really pinpoint where something became sexually arousing in their childhood. Like, for instance, somebody who's interested in balloon play, for instance, might have had a sexually arousing experience upon hearing a balloon, let's say at like a 12th birthday party or something popping. And they can kind of think back to that kind of experience and they can find the roots in their childhood. Similarly, you might find somebody who found themselves sexually aroused when they were going through a cousin's underwear drawer and found their stockings and were like, ooh, I love these, and can actually pinpoint that. So there certainly are roots in childhood for a lot of people. But I think we get kind of stuck in that notion where people will be like, oh, there must have been something that happened that caused this kink, and that must be the reason.
Right.
When actually, as you know, our psychological framework is so much more complex than that. And a lot of people may just find that they develop a kink later in life and it doesn't necessarily have any roots in childhood or any one particular thing that happened to them or some experience that they had, but they just find that it's something that turns them on later in life. Basically, it's complicated. And I think when people get very hung up on trying to figure out where their kinks come from, I think a lot of that has to do with the roots in shame, because they're like, oh, if I can figure out why I have this sexual proclivity, then I will be able to stop myself from having it. I think that's often the narrative that people are working from, when really it doesn't really matter why you have a kink. What's actually important is figuring out how you can accept that about yourself and figure out a way to embrace it in a way that feels authentic and safe for you.
Yeah. And I think reflecting back on some of the research that I've read about kink, some of that work finds that there are as many as like 8 distinct categories of reasons why people might be into kink. And for some of them, it's something that was an interest that developed very early on in life and almost became kind of this orientation. And they can tie a very specific event or experience that usually happened around the time of puberty when their hormones were raging to the emergence of this particular sexual interest. But that's only one pathway, right? Some people aren't introduced to kink until much later in life. Like, for example, it's possible maybe in your 20s, 30s, or 40s, you have a partner who suggests the idea of trying something kinky and you decide to go along with it and you find that you really like it and enjoy it. That might lead you down the path of becoming kinky, but it doesn't have anything to do with something that happened early in life. And then we also know there are people for whom kink is kind of this trauma response, where in their kinky practices, they're reenacting a previous trauma. And that can actually be therapeutic for them because maybe it's a way of taking control of a previous trauma that was about a situation where they felt totally powerless, right? There are also people who don't become kinky until much later in life, right? So I've read some stories and works about people who are in their 70s or 80s who become kinky, and it's actually a way of kind of managing or dealing with chronic pain that they experience, because pain that's experienced through kink is a controllable form of pain. And so there's something that's kind of empowering about that sometimes to people who are dealing with chronic pain issues. And those are just a few of the many different reasons why people might be into kink. So I totally get what you're saying, where there's a lot of people who really kind of want to search for what is the answer? Where did this come from? And they think that it has this deeper meaning, but it doesn't always, and sometimes, and I think you talk about this a little bit in the book, people just enjoy kink because it's fun, right? That can also be another reason that people are kinky, right?
Absolutely. I mean, kink is at its core, it's kind of a way that we actually get to play as adults. We get to, I say this in the book, but people do get really triggered when I say inner child. And I don't mean like an actual child, but it's sort of the carefree, lighthearted version of yourself that gets to kind of let all of your stresses go, let all these like responsibilities that you have that are going on in life, and you get to step out of that for a minute into a safe container and explore and have fun. And so I think that it doesn't necessarily matter where kink comes from necessarily. It's more about embracing you as a complex individual. People who have kinks often have a lot of shame around them. And when we can actually unlock this idea that it's like, this is play, it's fun, at its core, it's really like a game, it becomes much more accessible to people.
There's nothing inherently wrong with somebody who kind of wants to understand their sexuality and where their interests came from. But when that is connected to feelings of shame, I think that's kind of a different story, because in this world of kink, you're right, there are a lot of people who feel ashamed of their interests, or who feel like they're the only one who has them, or that they're weird or unusual, or that it must mean they have a mental disorder. Like, that's a whole other thing and issue that's involved there. And that's where I think books like yours can be of great value to a lot of people who are experiencing and dealing with sexual shame, is because a lot of people feel alone in their kinks. But it turns out being kinky is actually pretty common, and odds are the things that you're into, a heck of a lot of other people are into as well. Now, a lot of kink is inherently about playing with power dynamics. So what is it about power play that is such a turn on to so many people? What's at the root of why giving up or taking power is so often eroticized?
I think it's really inherent in just the way the humans function. The giving and taking of control is something that is kind of something we see in all these different places in our lives. But when it comes to sexuality, I don't want to paint with broad strokes here, but so you might see somebody who has, a horrible boss who treats them terribly, and they feel really powerless at their job. And then when they step into kink, and they might be a more dominant person, they're actually being given this power in such a consensual and loving way. And they actually get to experience that kind of leadership that they may not get to in their real life. Obviously, some people might be total doms at work and total doms in bed, like everybody, different strokes for different folks. But I think the giving and taking of power is kind of in itself really inherently erotic, because it takes such a large amount of trust, and it creates such a container for two people to connect on such an intimate and physical level.
Yeah, I've talked to a lot of dominatrixes about the work that they do, and many of them are individuals who work with like these high-powered male executives who want to come in to the dungeon and just be totally submissive. And, as they describe it, it's kind of about how in everyday life, they're constantly in control and have to be making decisions. And then in the context of being with the dominatrix, they can totally give up all of that power and control. And it's sort of this way for them of kind of seeking balance. And I think that that's sort of the stereotype that's out there, is that the roles that we take in everyday life are the opposite of the roles that we want to take sexually. And so I'm curious for your take on that. Like, we know that there's always individual variability, but is it true, do you think, more often than not, that people are kind of seeking that balance? Or is it more true that like who we are out of bed is also who we are in bed? Hey guys, if you're looking for more confidence in the bedroom or just want to improve your performance, you need to know about FirmTech, because they're changing the game. When you've tracked 136,000 erections like they have, you learn a lot, and FirmTech is using that data to transform men's sexual health. Here's the deal. Most ED treatment is still trial and error. It's guesswork. But FirmTech's Tech Ring changes that by giving you and your doctor real data: how firm you're getting, how long you're staying there, whether your meds are working, and whether pumps, PRP, or shockwave therapy are likely to do anything for you. It can even help optimize your dosing of ED meds, backed by actual science. But what I love most is this. The Tech Ring doesn't just measure erections, it improves them. Its design helps keep more blood in the penis, which means harder erections, more staying power, and more intense orgasms. FirmTech's database also uncovered something big. For most guys, fading erections aren't dysfunction, they're venous leak. That means you can get hard, but blood just doesn't stay in the penis. It starts leaving before you want it to. The Tech Ring picks that up early, long before you consciously notice anything. It can even flag cardiovascular-related ED, which is the kind that you don't want to ignore. The bottom line is this: every man is somewhere on the spectrum from erectile fitness to erectile dysfunction. FirmTech gives you the tools and the data to stop, slow, or even reverse that trend. Check the show notes for the link and save 15% off your FirmTech order with code JUSTIN15. Stay fit, stay firm.
In kink, you're probably going to see more people stepping into a different role, because it's kind of a chance to explore something different. But again, I don't want to paint with broad strokes, because a lot of people may be exactly the same as they are in life as they are in bed. It's really just about where you feel more comfortable on that kink spectrum. And I think that's kind of the thing too, is like, you don't have to have this alter ego in kink. It can 100% be authentically you. You can be exactly the same person as a dom as you are at work, just, in a more sexual context, but like your vibe is the same. Mm-hmm. But I do think that people by and large probably want to experience maybe something that's on the opposite spectrum as a means of escape, if I had to guess.
And it's also the case that people don't always necessarily adopt just one role, right? I think I've seen some research recently that said that it's actually more common for people to be switches in the world of kink than it is for them to have one exclusive role. So some people might enjoy that variety of kind of being able to go back and forth and not necessarily be constrained to taking on one specific role every time they engage in kink practices. And, it could also be that maybe you have some partners with whom you adopt one role and other partners with whom you adopt a different role. So yeah, again, it goes back to how this world of kink is complex, and there isn't just like a one size fits all rule for how people approach it. But something I was thinking about as I was putting my questions together for you is why interest in power exchange seems to be on the rise. Of course, kink and power dynamics are not new, right? Humans have probably been having kinky sex for as long as they've been having sex. But I can't help but wonder whether part of this kind of renewed interest that we seem to be seeing in kink and power play, this broader cultural moment that we're having around kink might have something to do with the fact that we're living in a world where people just increasingly feel powerless. There's this constant stream of crises that emerge every single day, and there's often very little that we can do about them to enact meaningful change. So is it possible, do you think, that people are drawn to kink, at least in part, because it offers this kind of structured, consensual way to experience control or surrender when so much of our life just feels out of control?
Yes, absolutely. That's an excellent point. I think that can be a huge appeal of it because we do live in a time that's incredibly polarizing, wild times out there politically, the economic situation, quite bleak. And, we aren't that far out from COVID. And it is a kind of crazy world that we're living in where every single day is this onslaught of doom scrolling. And when you step into kink dynamics, you get to have this kind of pure escapism because you get to create this dynamic where you can be exactly who you want to be, giving and taking control in this very boundaried, very consensual way. And it's a way to feel that kind of safety while also exploring control or the giving and receiving of it.
Yeah. And, you bring up a lot of things there, related to crises that have occurred that made us feel powerless, like the pandemic, like everything that's going on politically. Anywhere that you live, there's likely to be a lot of stuff that's going on right now that just kind of makes us feel helpless or powerless. And so, yeah, kink is, I think, potentially a way that people do try to gain at least somewhat more control in their own lives, or at least gain that temporary sense of control. And that goes back to what I was saying earlier about, some older adults with chronic pain issues using consensual pain during kink as a way of taking control of their pain. And so I think maybe it is possible that more broadly, people are kind of drawn to kink for that sense of just kind of gaining some control and also that sense of escape, right? So escapism is another big part of kink because we know that kink fundamentally changes your headspace, right? And can you talk to us a little bit about that and how when we're engaged in kink, it sort of allows us to be more present and in the moment?
Yeah, a lot of the appeal of kink dynamics and the container that we create with our partners can really change our mental state entirely. You might experience something called subspace, or you might experience dom space, which is a kind of it's akin to sort of a runner's high where you're kind of flooded with these endorphins. You're in quite an embodied space. And then also because you're playing with these sorts of things like sensation play, whether it's flogging, whether it's candle wax, whether it's just an ice cube run up your partner's body, there's a lot of kind of physical sensations that bring you into a very embodied experience. It's really an opportunity to almost have a sort of sexual meditation in its own sort of metaphorical way.
Sexual meditation. I like that term. So we've talked about some of the things that people get wrong about kink, including the idea that people who are into it necessarily have some history of trauma. But I'm curious, what are some of the other things that you talk about in the book that people get wrong about kink? What are some of the other common myths or misconceptions about it?
Oh, there's so many. We could do an entire podcast just on that. Like you said, that one of the big ones is that people assume that you have some kind of trauma background. There's, of course, sort of piggybacking on that. If you're into kink, you must be some kind of sexual deviant, which we are proud perverts, but not deviants. And we're not mentally ill because we want to do something sexually outside of the box. So I think those are kind of really big ones. And then we have this other one, which is, 50 Shades of Grey did not do us a service with this one, but that kink is abuse.
Right.
Basically, the dom is this horrible person who's taking all their aggression out on this sub. And could not be further from the truth. The sub has just as much power, if not now equal power to the dom. Everybody in this exchange is doing so willingly, consensually. They have boundaries. They've had discussions. There's safe words. It's a really fun dynamic, but I think that we use these kinds of myths and misconceptions to demonize sexuality, which you'll see in all kinds of sexual myths that are out there.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point about 50 Shades in terms of the way that it depicts kink. And it has received a lot of criticism from within the kink community for various reasons. But I think one is that it doesn't necessarily deal with that issue of consent really well. And when we're talking about consensual kink, that is fundamentally different from sexual abuse, right? It is also important to recognize that there are some people who try to use kink as a way of covering up sexual abuse, like where they will commit acts of sexual violence and then actually gaslight their partner by just telling them that that was kink or something, right? Or if they get arrested for it, they'll use the bogus BDSM defense where they say that that wasn't sexual abuse, like we're just kinky people. And so there are cases where that term kink gets misused. And I think it comes down to that fundamental misconception, this idea that, kink and abuse are one and the same, but actually they couldn't be more different.
Absolutely. Nothing gets me more fired up than people in abusive dynamics using the language of kink and co-opting it to commit abuse. It makes me nuts.
Yeah, and for good reason. So how common is kink curiosity, really, right? So how many people are actually interested in exploring kink? And why do you think we still have this tendency to underestimate how common it is?
I'm going to go a little bit rogue here. I think almost everybody has a little bit of interest in kink. I mean, I don't think everybody would admit that or would buy my book and actually explore it. But I think when you kind of understand, and if you read my book, you will, people, understand exactly what kink is and why people are interested in it, it can really open your mind to be like, oh, I actually hadn't thought about sort of these things before, and I hadn't really considered that. And you can kind of open up your mind to having more of these curiosities. But if you kind of look at some of the porn data that's out there and what people are watching, and if you read your book, that people are much more interested in spicy sex than they are willing to admit.
Yeah. And certainly if you just asked people on a survey, do you identify as kinky? You're probably not going to have a super high percentage. But if you ask them, have you ever had this specific fantasy before? Or have you ever engaged in this specific behavior before? And you ask about a wide range of kink interests and practices, you're going to find that the numbers are shockingly high, right? So I found that in my own work when I was studying sexual fantasies, more than 90% of my participants were reporting having had a kinky fantasy before. Now, that doesn't mean that all of them want to act on those fantasies or that they will act on them. Fantasy, desire, and behavior are three different things. They certainly overlap to some extent, but I think it is fair to say that most of us have some element of kink interest in us somewhere, whether that's having had a kinky fantasy before or actually really wanting to try something out that's kinky with a partner, or maybe having done it before in the past. And we have plenty of survey data and evidence to back that up at this point. But one other question for you about this topic of kink, if someone who's listening to this has a kink, but they feel a lot of shame around it, what do you think is the most helpful reframe or mindset shift that would be helpful for them?
I think you need to start looking at where the role of shame is coming into your life, what about this is causing such discomfort. And I think when you can start to peel back some of those layers, some of those lessons, and start to look at how do I actually feel about something rather than lessons that were given to me without my consent. And when you can start to peel some of that back, you can start to become more curious about it. And honestly, I would suggest people find online communities for the thing that they are interested in, not on the free tube sites when I say communities, but forums like Reddit, and there's a subreddit for anything. If you have a kink, I promise you there is a subreddit for it. So it can be really liberating, I think, to speak to other people in a kind of neutral environment about what it is that you're feeling. And people on there are actually pretty nice. And I think it can start to help you look at things in a more grounded way rather than having to think that you're this freaky weirdo, because I guarantee you you're not. And it's a very normal part of the human sexual landscape and erotic blueprint to be interested in sexuality that isn't exactly socially prescribed.
Totally agree. And for anyone who has some level of shame around what it is that they're interested in sexually, I think reading, learning, exploring is one of the most helpful first steps, because helping you to realize that you're not alone in having that interest, I think, is really kind of the first hurdle that helps to normalize it to some extent. And then also finding your people, the people who also share those interests, just being able to talk and converse, even if it's just anonymously online or just to read posts that other people are writing, I think can be very helpful and therapeutic in terms of relieving some of that shame and guilt and embarrassment associated with people who feel really conflicted about their own sexual fantasies.
Yeah. And pick up my book, because there's a lot of journal prompts in there that are going to make you think real deeply about this.
That they will. Well, this has been fascinating, Gigi. I'm really looking forward to our conversation in the next episode where we're going to dive into some very specific niche kinks.
Excited about it.
Can you please tell my listeners where they can go to learn more about you and your work and get a copy of your new book, Kink Curious?
Sure. Yeah. You can find me on my website at missgigiangle.com. I also have a Substack, the G Spot, where I talk about all these things. And my book, Kink Curious, comes out January 21st and is available everywhere books are sold.
Well, great. And I'll be sure to include links to all of that in the show notes. Thank you again so much for your time. I really appreciate having you here.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening. To keep up with new episodes of this podcast, visit my website, Sex and Psychology, at sexandpsychology.com, or subscribe on your favorite platform, where I hope you'll take a moment to rate and review the show. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, please consider becoming a Sex and Psychology premium subscriber to enjoy ad-free listening for just $3.99 a month. You can also follow me on social media for daily sex research updates. I'm on Blue Sky and X at Justin Lehmiller and Instagram at Justin J. Lehmiller. Also, be sure to check out my book, Tell Me What You Want. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.